The strange thing is that on the surface, almost nothing about Gumball has changed. He still looks exactly the same. He still has the same voice, the same family, the same best friend, and he still spends most of his time getting himself and everyone around him into completely ridiculous situations. If you watched a random episode from the later seasons without knowing the history of the show, you might even think that this is exactly the same Gumball we met years ago. But when you actually compare his behavior, the difference becomes much harder to ignore. Early Gumball was already selfish, arrogant, jealous, and impulsive. He could make terrible decisions for the stupidest reasons, and half the time Darwin had to clean up the mess he created. But there was always another side to him. Gumball could recognize when someone was genuinely hurt. He could become protective when Darwin was in danger. He could admit when he had gone too far, and when something truly mattered to him, his selfishness could disappear almost instantly. That contrast was what made him work. Gumball wasn't supposed to be a perfect hero. In fact, his flaws were the entire point. He was a kid with a huge ego, almost no common sense, and an incredible talent for making every situation worse. But underneath all of that was someone who genuinely loved the people around him. His relationship with Darwin especially proved that. No matter how ridiculous their arguments became, there was always a sense that these two actually needed each other. As the series progressed, however, that balance slowly began to disappear. The writers became more comfortable pushing Gumball's personality to its absolute limit. His selfishness wasn't just something that caused occasional problems anymore. It increasingly became the reason the entire plot existed. His impulsive decisions became more extreme. His schemes became more destructive. And instead of making a bad decision because he didn't understand the consequences, Gumball would sometimes make one simply because it was funny to watch everything fall apart. And that changes how we see the character. There is a huge difference between watching a flawed kid make a terrible mistake and watching a character repeatedly create problems because the audience already expects him to behave irrationally. The first makes you want to see him learn something. The second makes you wonder why everyone around him still puts up with him. That's where later Gumball becomes much more complicated. His sarcasm becomes harsher. His confidence starts looking more like arrogance. His creativity turns into reckless behavior. His selfishness becomes harder to excuse. Even when someone else is clearly suffering because of his actions, Gumball can sometimes remain focused on proving that he was right. And the most important part is that the show doesn't always punish him for it. Sometimes the disaster simply becomes the joke. That worked because The Amazing World of Gumball was always a surreal comedy. The series could turn almost anything into an absurd situation. But over time, Gumball himself became one of the biggest sources of that absurdity. Instead of the world constantly making Gumball's life difficult, Gumball increasingly became the person making everyone else's life difficult. And that is a subtle but important transformation. The old Gumball could be the problem. The later Gumball often became the reason there was a problem in the first place. This is also why Darwin's role becomes so important. Darwin increasingly acts as the moral balance to Gumball's behavior. When Gumball gets carried away, Darwin is the one who questions him. When Gumball makes an insane decision, Darwin is usually the one who has to think about the consequences. And eventually, the series even turns that relationship into an actual conflict, where Darwin begins questioning whether Gumball's influence is helping him at all. That moment is important because it exposes something that the audience had been watching for years without necessarily realizing it. Gumball isn't just chaotic anymore, he's becoming a bad influence. And once the show starts acknowledging that through Darwin, the character's evolution becomes impossible to ignore. The irony is that Gumball never completely loses his good side. That's what makes this so interesting. He can still love Darwin, he can still care about his family, he can still become genuinely emotional when someone important to him is in danger. The good Gumball is still there, he's just buried under much more of everything else. It's almost as if the writers took every trait that made Gumball entertaining and kept turning it up. His sarcasm became sharper, his selfishness became bigger, his stupidity became more extreme, his anger became more explosive, his schemes became more ridiculous. And eventually the character started feeling less like a flawed kid who sometimes causes chaos and more like a walking disaster who occasionally reminds us why we used to root for him. That is why the change can be so difficult to notice. Gumball didn't receive a dramatic redesign. He didn't suddenly become evil. There wasn't one episode where everything changed forever. His transformation happened through hundreds of small decisions, jokes, conflicts, and increasingly extreme versions of the same personality traits. And by the time you look back at the entire series, you realize that the character who started as a reckless but surprisingly caring kid had slowly become something much more extreme. The face was still the same. The world was still the same. Darwin was still beside him. But the balance that made Gumball feel like a genuinely lovable disaster was slowly disappearing. And once that balance was gone, the question wasn't whether Gumball was still funny. The question was whether there was still enough of the old Gumball left to make us care about him.